right into it. Today's session, looking at market entry barriers. And we're going to be covering 5 main areas today. The first of which is literally asking the question, what are market entry barriers? Number 2, the types of market entry barriers that you can expect to encounter as you embark on your international journey, or indeed expand what you're already doing internationally. And also then we're going to pause on what are non-tariff barriers, the types of non-tariff barriers, and what you can do about NTBs that you encounter in the market. So let's start off with market entry barriers. Now, of course, we spent a fair bit of time in the previous session, or was the one before, I think. Time kind of blurs into one when you do several of these things in a row. But we have looked quite extensively at what you need to do before you enter a new market. All the research that you need to be concentrating on, all the various areas, all the things you need to be taking into account. And of course, you would already have drawn up a fair list of things that could be considered to be market entry barriers. But today we're specifically going to be looking at economic market entry barriers, so the sorts of things that economists consider when they look at barriers to entry, not just into a new international market in terms of a country, but also the sorts of things you can experience if you are expanding your product range into a new market, for example. So you might be in a particular market in terms of geography, but you would be looking at expanding into a different area of product or service within that market. You will encounter the same sort of market entry barriers. So what are market entry barriers? So the American economist Joe S. Bain defines market entry barrier as an advantage of established sellers in an industry over potential entrant sellers. So essentially, those who are already there have an inherent advantage over those who are attempting to come in. It's really that simple. So a primary barrier to entry is the cost that constitutes an economic entry barrier on its own. So simply the cost that you as a new entrant into any market need to incur to go into that market is a barrier to entry. An ancillary barrier to entry refers to the cost that does not include a barrier to entry by itself, but reinforces other barriers to entry if they are present. So it's not just the cost that you will incur if you are going into a new market, but it is all the other things that you will encounter once you are in that market that incumbents do not necessarily encounter. Those are ancillary barriers to entry, and we'll look at those in more detail. So when we're looking at those market entry barriers, there are essentially 2 types. There's the natural barrier to entry, which is a structural thing, and the artificial barrier to entry, which is a strategic one. So natural barriers to entry include economies of scale. So if a market has significant economies of scale that have already been exploited by existing companies to a large extent, the new entrants are automatically deterred. So what are economies of scale? When we talk about economies of scale, we talk to the cost of advantage that is connected to increased levels of output. So the more you output, the lower your cost becomes. And this is an inverse relationship between the per unit fixed cost and the quantity produced. So again, the more you make, the less it costs you for every unit that you produce. Economies of scale also result in a fall in average variable costs, so those average non-fixed costs that have an increase in output. So this, of course, happens because operational efficiencies become a factor, and a result of the increase in the scale of production brings down some of those non-fixed costs as well. Now, what does this mean for you if you are entering a new market? Well, the incumbents already have the economy of scale. The incumbents are already producing in that market, they are already selling in that market, and they probably have already reached some form of critical mass in that market. So when you as a new entrant come in, your fixed cost per unit is going to be significantly higher as you try to scale up because you don't have the volume of turnover already. And that, of course, is a natural barrier to entry. Then there's the network effect. Now, this refers to the effect that multiple users have on the value of a product or service in terms of other users. So if a strong network already exists in a particular market, it will limit the chances of new entrants gaining a sufficient number of users and customers. So the network effect is a phenomenon where present users of a product or service benefit in some way when the product or service is adopted by additional users. So it's created by many users when value is added to the use of the product. Now, I guess the simplest or the most well-known effect here is the internet, which of course is a network of networks where people connect to each other, and the more they connect, the bigger the network becomes and the more saturated it becomes. Now, in the case of having an existing market with existing players in that market, as opposed to new players entering the market, the existing ones already have the networks. So for them to grow those networks exponentially and their networks effectively become self-propagating is something that is already occurring. If you enter that market, it's difficult to break into those networks and to start establishing networks of your own because people don't necessarily see the value in joining new networks. Another barrier to entry, which is a natural one, is the high research and development costs that very often go hand in hand with expanding into a new market. So when organizations are spending huge amounts on research and development, we also understand that they probably have pretty deep pockets. So if you are entering a market where somebody is already expending a great deal of money on these research and development costs, to compete, you would have to match or indeed exceed that level of expenditure. So you will have to not only be doing far more research and development, you will have to be seen to be doing it so that the market has a measure of confidence in your ability to do something unique and different in that market. High setup costs are, of course, one of the major deterrents in going into a new market. And very often these costs cannot be fully recovered when you move into a new market. So here we're talking about fixed costs like advertising and marketing, but also those other fixed costs like rental, setting up from a business perspective. So what do you have to do to register the business, to comply with any regulations in market, etc. Of course, this is if you are going to set up in a market physically, but some of these costs also are incurred even if you are not physically in the market and you are just selling into the market through distribution costs, etc., or indeed selling in through e-commerce, where some of the costs that you probably cannot recoup are those costs of setting up your new website, additional marketing, social media channels that you have to expand, digital marketing, etc. So those are all things to bear in mind. Existing incumbents in a market already own the key resources and the raw material in those markets simply by virtue of having been there. And this is particularly marked in areas like resources. So if you are going into a new mining operation, for example, it might be very difficult to compete with incumbents in that market. But it's not just for those really large top end of town type experiences. Smaller businesses very often face a similar scenario, particularly if you are setting up in a market and you need to establish supply chains that are in that market. You might find that it's very difficult for you to do so because they are already in the hands of your competitors in that market. Now, I might just mention that if you have any questions as we go through today, feel free to type them in the chat box. If it's relevant, I'll take them immediately. If not, we'll wait to the end for your question, but don't wait to pose it because you might forget as we move through. So we've looked at those natural barriers to market entry. Now the artificial ones. So these are the ones that competitors in that market specifically put in place to keep new players out. And these are the things that are sometimes really hard to put your finger on because they're not always that obvious when you are looking from the outside. The first one that we really do need to focus on is predatory pricing. and acquisition plays into this as well. But predatory pricing is really just a business that is already in market that deliberately lowers their prices to keep competitors out. And this will very often happen that's first, soon as you make that first foray into a new market, suddenly you find that the people already there reduce their prices. And that makes it very difficult for you to compete, because you have to match that price if you're going to have any look in. And in the meanwhile, all your other costs are exponentially higher already. So it becomes very difficult to actually make a profit. And then, of course, organizations, larger ones, do have a tendency also to buy out their potential competitors. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Maybe that gives you the necessary cash input that you have to start something else, but you don't necessarily want to be acquired. So obviously, it depends on where it is that you see yourself in the grand scheme of things. We tend to see this happening as well, where, for example, you might have a dairy manufacturer in Australia. So you have somebody that has a farming interest that runs dairy cattle, produces milk and dairy products, sells those into a particular overseas market. And then a competitor in that market, instead of trying to find an alternate source of supply, ends up purchasing the Australian operation, and they then effectively supply their own market with what would have been their competitor's product. So that happens on a fairly regular basis in a market like Australia, particularly in the ag sector. Limit pricing is when an existing business sets a low price and a high output so that you can't make a profit at that price. So they produce a lot more, and because they produce more, they can cut their prices and still maintain their margins. But you who are coming in can't maintain the volumes, and therefore you cannot maintain the price because you can't make sufficient margin so that you can actually make a profit. Of course, advertising is something which is really important as well. Now, advertising is a sunk cost, and a sunk cost, quite frankly, is one that you incur, but you can't recover it directly. The amount that is spent by incumbent firms can increase exponentially as soon as they notice that there is a foray by a new player in the market. So suddenly the local companies start doing huge amounts of advertising, saturating the market and making it very difficult for any new players to enter. And then there's brand. Those already there are well known. They already have established brands. They have customer loyalty as a result of that. And therefore, it's very difficult for a new player to enter that market. And it's very difficult sometimes to establish a new brand against an existing one, particularly one that has some sort of national interest and people have a loyalty to it, not just because of the product and the brand itself, but because of who that brand is and what it is associated with. So I've had a question, a statement that's come in. Sanjay said, markets are different, their barriers may be different. So where do we look to estimate the costs? Well, Sanjay, that's an interesting question because really it's a very fraught question. Yes, absolutely. Every single market is different, and we've talked about that at length in previous sessions, and every market is going to have different barriers to entry, and they'll all have some form of all of these, but some will be more emphasized than other. So where do you go to find the cost? You literally have to do your research on a case-by-case basis. So you have to understand what it's going to cost you to set up in a new market, what it's going to cost you to advertise, to market in a new cost, what it's going to cost you to get your goods into that new market. So you have to do a full costing, and we've gone through the lists of all the costs that are involved if you are exporting. So you need to go through that entire list, and you have to do a proper breakdown of your costs. You then have to do a cost analysis. And it's simply a cost benefit analysis. So this is how much it's going to cost me to go into this new market. These are the potential benefits from a cash flow perspective, etc. So you have to do some forecasting, And then you have to make an economic decision. It's either a viable option for you to do or not. And it might not be a viable option in the first year or even two, but your forecast might show that by year 3 or 4, you are starting to break even. And by year 5, you're making a profit. And once you start making that profit, you can afford to remain in that market and it will be worthwhile in the long term. Now, that's an economic decision that only you as a business owner can make. Nobody can make that for you. So you can get as much advice as possible. You have to find out on the ground of the market that you're going into what the costs are there, and do your research. So it comes back to that old homework piece. You absolutely have to do that costing, and then you have to make a sound business decision. And of course, in order to do that, you have to be able to sustain that foray into the new market, which means your current business cannot be put under so much strain that it is going to suffer and possibly flounder because you are investing in your new market. So it has to be a cost benefit analysis, and that is really the only way that you can do it. So brand is very, very important for you to establish if you are going into a new market. And the sooner you can establish your own brand, the sooner you might be able to compete with the brands that are already there. Now, some other artificial barriers to entry: contracts, patents, licenses. If incumbent businesses already have contracts with all the major potential customers that you would be looking at, it's very difficult for you to break in. If they already hold patents, licenses, they have things like registered trademarks, etc., in that market, it becomes very difficult for new businesses to enter and to then register your own intellectual property in that market, because it will be very difficult for you to prove that you have something unique and registrable. You might also find that in certain markets, so in a market like China, for example, which is a first to file jurisdiction in intellectual property terms, that means that somebody in that market may already have filed and therefore own your trademarks. So it would be very difficult for you to come in and register your own. So those are things that you need to do some detailed research on before you decide to go into a new market. And before you make your foray into that market, you have to register all the intellectual property that you can before you go. And bear in mind that when it comes to intellectual property, it's only protected in the market in which it's registered. Of course, if you have an international patent, for example, that you have registered in the world, it would be wherever it's been registered. But all of your IP, if you've registered it only in Australia, it's protected only in Australia. You have to register it and protect it in other markets as well. Loyalty schemes are a big barrier. So these are the sorts of things that incumbent firms have, that you buy from us, you get this. Those point schemes, for example, frequent flyer programs being a case in point. So if you were considering starting an airline and moving into a particular market, and there's already an airline there and they have a frequent flyer program, chances are new flyers are not going to come to you. Not if they already have substantial investment in loyalty, bonuses, and benefits with the incumbent. And that is a very real way of keeping potential competitors out of a market. Switching costs are the costs that are incurred by a customer when trying to switch suppliers. So if I am purchasing from a certain company and a new player comes into the market, I really like what I see from the new player, but in order to buy from the new one, I need to switch from the existing one. There might be costs incurred, and that might make it less attractive for me to do that switching. This is particularly marked in the case of services exporters. So if you are a provider of services and you are looking to break into a new market, it might be very difficult for customers to switch their services from the incumbent in that market to you, because they will incur costs and penalties if they do so. On a local level, for example, if you look at home loans, you have your home loan with a specific bank, you try to take your mortgage to another bank, you certainly can do that, that's your right, but the existing one charges you a penalty to do that, which might make it less attractive for you to move. It's very similar in international markets when you are coming in from outside and people already have existing relationships and existing contracts with suppliers in that market. Now, we've looked at those economic barriers to entry that you will incur every time you go into a new market. And that new market can be a new geographical market, it can be a different sector of an industry, a market in that term. But of course, there aren't just economic barriers to entry. I'm just going to take a question before we move on. Question from Ram Kumar, who asks, is the franchisee option an option? Of course it is. So depending on how you choose to set up in a market, and again, we've already gone over the different distribution models that you might consider. If you are setting up a franchise operation in a new market where there is an existing network of franchises in this particular market, then obviously your brand automatically is the local brand. So that is it's a way for you to overcome that issue. But then bear in mind that you are not going in under your own name. You are essentially buying another name that already exists. So let's say, for example, you are a supplier of specialist cleaning services and you move into a new market and you buy a franchise that equates to a Jim's Cleaning here. You become Jim's Cleaning Milwaukee, for example, in the United States. You are Jim's Cleaning. So all those barriers to entry fall away because you are essentially a local business once you've purchased that franchise. Of course, that's very simplified. There are various things that may prevent you buying that franchise in the first place, because you still have to meet all the regulatory requirements, etc. But assuming that all of that has already been done, you buy the franchise, well, then you go in and you are just the local supplier. So I hope that's answered your question. As I say, it's simplification, but I think it kind of gives you the idea of what the difference is. If, however, you went in and you started your own cleaning business in Milwaukee and you went in under your own name, you set up a complete business as a foreign-owned business, it would be a whole different thing, because then you're competing with all the Jim's Cleanings in that area, but also all the other cleaning operations that are already there. Right, so moving on to non-tariff barriers. So we've looked at those economic barriers to entry. These are the barriers that are put in place by governments, pretty much, and by other incumbents in an almost backdoor way. So what are non-tariff barriers or non-tariff measures, sort of interrelated term? So non-tariff barriers are trade barriers that restrict the import or export of goods through means other than tariffs. So tariff, of course, is the duty that is payable on a good when it is imported into a particular market. And that duty is set by various government agencies, and there are all sorts of rules and regulations that govern how they determine what a tariff is on a particular good. And it could be 5%, it could be 10%, it could be much, much higher. So if, for example, we look at the situation around Australian wine imports into China, just recently the tariff, the duty payable on Australian wine has increased exponentially. When we're talking about non-tariff barriers, we're talking about those barriers that are not related to tariff. So it's got nothing to do with how much duty is payable on your good. It is all those other things that are in place behind the border that make it more difficult for your goods to enter. So the World Trade Organization, the WTO, identifies various non-tariff barriers. And those tariff barriers include import licensing, pre-shipment inspections, rules of origin, and custom delays. So non-tariff barriers are, in fact, any kind of red tape, in inverted commas, or trade rules that unjustifiably restrict the flow of goods and services. And it's very important there that you take note of unjustifiably, because some of these are perfectly justifiable. It's when they're unjustifiable that they are considered a non-tariff barrier to trade. And I've had a question about how you mitigate these. Well, we'll get to that in a moment or two. So again, what are NTBs? So developed countries use non-tariff barriers as an economic strategy to control the level of trade that they conduct with other countries. When making decisions on those non-tariff barriers to implement in international trade, countries base the barriers on the availability of goods and services for import and export, as well as the existing political alliances they have with other trade partners. Tariffs and duties could be reduced or eliminated if, for example, a free trade agreement is entered into. And instead of then just leaving that as it is, other barriers are put in place to help protect local industries and businesses. Conversely, most developing nations still very much rely on the tariffs and duties as a way for them to raise finance for national projects. And then they also still manage to regulate their trade with other countries in that way. So developing nations very rarely use non-tariff barriers as a measure. They just rely on duties and tariffs. So when we look at the types of NTB, and there are several sort of recognized categories of them, there are protectionist barriers. Protectionist barriers are all of those that are designed to protect certain sectors of domestic industry at the expense of other countries. So these restrictions make it very difficult for other countries to compete favorably with locally produced goods and services. And these barriers take the form of licensing requirements, the allocation of quotas, anti-dumping duties, import deposits, etc. And anti-dumping, of course, is an interesting one. You might often read in the various newspapers and so on in Australia that we've got actions going against dumping. Dumping is simply when a good enters and is sold in a new market at below the cost that it is produced in its country of origin. You cannot justify that, and that is dumping. But very often dumping is used as a mechanism, and something is referred to as dumping when in fact it isn't, but it stops goods coming in, at least for a period of time while the investigation occurs. And this again was a similar scenario with Australian wine in China just recently, where Australian wine producers were accused of dumping at a lower cost than they were producing in Australia. And those cases are ongoing. So protectionist barriers put in place all of these various things, not from a justified perspective, but unjustifiably to keep others out of that country and protect local industries. Then there are non-protectionist policies. Now, non-protectionist policies actually aren't directly designed to restrict the import or the export of goods and services, but the outcomes could be very similar. So they're primarily designed to protect health and safety of people and animals while also maintaining the integrity of the environment. So the classic case here is quarantine. And Australia is very often accused by other countries of non-tariff barriers being put in place because of our very stringent quarantine rules. So if there's a quarantine rule, any good that comes in that is subject to potential inspection from a quarantine perspective could be refused entry if it doesn't comply. You cannot just bring in fresh fruit and produce into Australia. You cannot bring in seeds and plants, etc., unless you have specific import permits to do that. And that is to keep out anything that could damage our natural environment. Similarly, other countries have rules and regulations around that too. And it's perfectly reasonable to do that, but it can be seen as a non-tariff barrier. And this could include things like having to have animal inspections, like having packaging that is of a certain kind. So if, for example, you are using wooden crates to package some of your goods when you send them overseas, you have to prove that that wood was harvested in a sustainable manner. You can't just use any old wood. So that obviously adds a layer of cost, and there are inspection costs, etc., and that is seen as a barrier. Similarly, you cannot bring in wood into Australia in terms of packaging because there could be worms in the wood and various other pests that could cause problems. So non-protectionist policies are those that actually have a very reasonable grounding, but could nevertheless stop you entering a new market or make it very expensive for you to enter a new market. So I've had a question that's come in. Somebody says it's a double-edged sword. If I'm a new entrant in the market and compete based on lower price, I'll be persecuted on protectionist barriers if I raise my price. So yes, it is a bit of a double-edged sword. The reality is that is the world of international trade. And that is one of the reasons why for SMEs, it's very often quite difficult to take that first step into a new international market because it can seem really daunting. The key to this is that you do it in a measured fashion. Just moving into a market because you think there's an opportunity there is not the right thing to do. You have to do it in a step-by-step way, and you have to do all your research. You have to take the time to do it properly rather than doing it on a reactionary way. If you do it properly, even if that takes you a year or two longer than you ideally would have liked it to have been done, you will find that you will incur far fewer costs and make far fewer mistakes, and therefore will actually be in a much better position to have a successful internationally trading business when you do take the step. So it's very important that the right advice is taken before you decide to enter a new market. And again, we spend quite a bit of time looking at what you should be taking into account before you choose a market. Obviously, the non-tariff barriers that are in place in that market are very important for you to consider as well. The third type of non-tariff barrier is what we refer to as assistive policies. So assistive policies are designed to protect domestic companies and enterprises. They don't directly restrict trade with other countries, but they do implement actions that impede free trade with other countries. So examples of assistive barriers include customs procedures. You might find that in certain ports, it just takes you as a foreign exporter of goods and for your customer as an importer of those goods considerably longer to bring goods in through the port. They're just far more red tapes put in place than they would be for other countries. So some countries will find it a lot easier to get through some ports and others more. Packaging and labeling requirements. So of course, every country has its own packaging and labeling requirements. We have them in Australia. Every country in the world has them, but that can be seen as a barrier. Even though it's very important for the domestic consumer in that country to have the information, it makes it very difficult for you, particularly if you have to have that labeling in another language, for example. And sometimes the rules change too. So you might just have got all your labeling and your packaging correct, and you comply, and then the rule changes, and then you have to do it all again. The same thing with technical standards and norms, sanitary standards, and so forth. So we have in Australia, we have Australian rules, and we expect every country that sells into this country of ours and every company that does so to comply with the Australian standard. Similarly, if you're going into the EU, you're going to have to comply with EU standards, etc. Now, very often those standards are translatable. So if we comply in Australia with Australian standards, we might get mutual recognition in another country. Some countries don't do that. You have to go through all those hoops again, and you have to incur all those costs to prove your standards and your certifications, etc. So that obviously it's assisting the local industry, it's assisting the local population, but it costs and therefore is a barrier to entry to others. International companies have to meet the requirements before they can be allowed to export or import certain goods into that market. And governments also help domestic companies very often by providing subsidies and bailouts so that they can then be competitive in their own market, and also so that they can be competitive in another market. So that happens as well. And that's something which is important to take into account. And of course, Australia is sometimes accused of doing the same thing, providing subsidies to local industry that then makes it very difficult for a competitor to come in and compete here. So it does work both ways. All countries do it. All regimes do it. In some cases, it's just done in a more punitive way than others. So just a few examples of NTBs. So licenses, they're one of the most common instruments that countries use to regulate the importation of goods. So a license system allows authorized companies to import specific commodities that are included on the list of licensed goods. And product license can be general or a one-time license. And the general license allows importation and exportation of permitted goods for a specific period, and the one-time just for a single transaction. And this is something that you're going to pay for, and it could be very expensive. And again, you might get a license, and the next time you want to export the same good, you can't get the license. And there will be all sorts of machinations behind the scene that have come to that particular moment in time. Quotas are quantitative restrictions that are imposed on imports and exports of a specific product for a specific period. And quotas are routinely administered by every country in the world to regulate the amount of a specific good that comes into that country. So it very often applies to fresh produce. So a specific quota of citrus, for example, is allowed to be imported into Indonesia. Once that quota has been met, either none of that product comes in again, irrespective of whether it was on the water at the time of the quota being met or not, or it can still enter, but the duty that then is imposed is considerably higher than when the good is exported within that quota. And this happens routinely, particularly with fresh produce, but it can happen with other commodities and other products as well. It's something that is very important to understand. If you are in an industry where you are exporting into a market that has a quota, you need to be across how much of that quota has already been consumed before you ship your goods to your customer in that country. The Australian government is really good about keeping a handle on that and informing you if you are getting close to the edge of the quota and you might run into trouble, but the onus really is on you to keep a check on it. And your customer in the other country will also have a pretty good handle on where they are in terms of where the quota sits. Embargoes are total bans of trade on specific commodities that are imposed, and they can be general and they can be seasonal. And an embargo means you just cannot get that good into that country for love or money. Now, of course, there are certain goods that are always embargoed without very specific rules and regulations being complied with. Weapons, you cannot just trade armaments as you see fit. You have to have a specific license to allow you to export arms from Australia, and the country to which you're exporting it needs specific requirements met before they can import. So that's a standard sort of thing. Of course, if you are exporting to a country that has sanctions against it, either international sanctions or Australia imposed sanctions, you can't trade with that country. There might be specific goods that are allowed, so usually food, medicaments, etc., but mostly you can't. So if you are trying to trade with a country that has sanctions against it, you probably just don't want to do that because you shouldn't be, and it will be very difficult for you to get exemptions to those embargoed goods. Import deposits are also used as a mechanism. So it's a form of foreign trade regulation that requires importers, so this would apply to your customer, to pay the central bank of the country a specified sum of money for a definite period, and that is the same value as the goods that they are importing. It doesn't happen all that commonly, but it does happen. And that means that your customer is going to have to effectively risk losing twice. They're going to risk losing the money that they've put in deposit and the money that they pay you for the goods. So there will obviously have to be some serious negotiation in place for that customer to take the risk on buying goods from you. As I say, not something that happens too commonly. Now, those are just some specific examples of NTBs. Obviously, there are any number of others, and there are many that are kind of hidden because they happen on a relatively ad hoc basis. So, for example, a few years ago, Australian honey was exported from Tasmania as it was allowed to be done to China. There was a specific port in China where the honey just wasn't released. It simply sat on the wharf for literally months on end till eventually it had crystallized and it just wasn't palatable anymore. But it also then had changed its HS code, so it wasn't the good that it was when it arrived, and that created all sorts of other issues. Other ports in China were perfectly happy to let the honey in. Similarly, in every country in the world, certain ports might be easier to get goods into than others. So those are all things that you need to get advice on the ground from, and very often your customer will be able to advise you too. So coming to the question of, well, non-tariff barriers, what can you do? You can do a fair bit, actually, and that is through the Australian government. So the Australian government is actively campaigning to remove non-tariff barriers for Australian businesses. It's all done through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who are coordinating a whole of government action plan to make it easier for businesses to access the help they need and improve collaboration, etc. There's a web address there. It's tradebarriers.gov.au, so quite a simple one, where you will find a wealth of information on those trade barriers and also a portal through which you can report any non-tariff barriers that you encounter. So if you have attempted to export a good into any particular market and you have encountered a barrier that doesn't have to do with a tariff, and you feel that that barrier was unfair to you as a business, you can lodge it on the portal. The Australian government then collects all of the evidence around all of those NTBs. And if enough companies report the same barrier in the same market, then the Australian government has a case to go to the World Trade Organization and make a case that this is an unjustifiable non-tariff barrier. But that only works if enough companies actually get together and report. So please, if you encounter anything when you go, report it. So there are specific areas where you can go to depending on the sector that you are in. For agriculture and food, the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources is equipped to help. And they really look very intensely at any barriers that are put in place to stop agricultural and food products leaving Australia and moving into other markets. You can get in touch with the Trade and Market Access Division, and you can see the email address there. I would suggest that probably the easiest thing for you to take a screenshot of these pages so that you've got the addresses. Manufacturing and resources, if you're facing a non-tariff barrier there, get in touch with the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources at tradefacilitation@industry.gov.au. And for services, because non-tariff barriers don't just apply to goods, they are more commonly applied to goods, but they certainly are applied to services as well, particularly when it comes to things like standards, licensing requirements and so forth that could be seen as punitive and unfair. So if you're a services exporter and you are being unfairly exported from stopped from exporting your services offshore, then DFAT itself will take your query, and that's services.competitiveness@dfat.gov.au. Of course, it's the federal government that regulates our trade regime, so it's the federal government that deals with these issues. If, however, you have encountered something and you do contact Global Victoria, they will also be able to kick it up the chain for you. So, by all means, if you've got a relationship with Global Victoria and your local representative, then have your first conversation with them and they can assist you to help strengthen your case with the federal government as well. Our customs agency, so for questions on any customs export requirements across all industries, the Department of Home Affairs. There's a telephone number there and they man that phone Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So if you're exporting a good and you're not sure whether you're allowed to export it from Australia or you're sending it somewhere and you're not sure of the rules and the regulations on the other side, customs can help. If customs doesn't have the information directly, they will direct you to the relevant customs authority in the country to which you are exporting, and you should be able to find the information that you need there. And then, of course, they also administer the Australian Trusted Trader Program. Trusted Trader is open to all businesses that are involved in international supply chains that can demonstrate compliant trade practices and a secure supply chain. If you are a member of the Trusted Trader Program, you jump through far fewer hoops to get your goods out of Australia. And if you are a trusted trader here and Australia has a commensurate relationship with the country to which you are exporting, then the importation on that side is also made a lot easier if you are a member of Australian Trusted Trader. So go to the website, it's abf.gov.au/trusted trader, or call them and they'll send somebody out to have a chat to you about the program and what you can do to comply. And when Trusted Trader was first launched about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a lot of talk that it really only applied to the top end of town because it was too expensive to comply, etc. That's actually not true. You can do it all yourself. You don't need the services of a consultant to do it for you. And it is specifically geared towards all Australian businesses.